to develop empathy for the underdog.
There's no question but that polio in many ways changed him. It represented, as one of his colleagues said, a plowing up of his nature. After that, he had a greater empathy for other people who had also had an unfair hand dealt to them in life that he might not have had simply coming from that aristocratic background. He became more serious. There was a depth to him that hadn't been seen before.
At an appearance before the Democratic National Convention of 1924, he arrived on crutches and hobbled his way to the podium. As the 1928 convention approached, he felt that was no longer good enough.
He told his doctors at Warm Springs, "I'll walk without crutches. I'll walk into a room without scaring everybody half to death. I'll stand easily enough in front of people so that they'll forget I'm a cripple." It was a significant effort.
It was an effort measured not in months, but in years. Along the way, he withdrew a significant portion of his trust fund to purchase Warm Springs for more than $200,000. Eleanor feared he was building a life in Georgia that excluded her and their 5 children. But he was insistent and quickly turned the facility into one of the nation's foremost centers for rehabilitation. He stayed for months at a time, acting as the Institute's unofficial physiotherapist. It remains one of his greatest and perhaps least known achievements. Appreciated by those like Hugh Gallagher, who, after getting polio at 17, went to the Institute for rehabilitation.
Everybody laughed at Warm Springs. We were not sick. We were not patients. We were people who were learning how to use the muscles we had. We had much peer support, much support from the older polios who had learned, and all of this was Roosevelt. This was the Roosevelt spirit.
It was a place where patients were encouraged to set goals and try for the impossible.
He developed what I guess you would call the illusion of walking at Warm Springs very deliberately over months and months of hard work in the Georgia sun, in which he walked from his shoulders, heaved one side of the body forward and then the other side, while resting one hand on a cane and gripping the arm of the strongest person he could find on the other, and throwing his head around and laughing and smiling and winking and shouting greetings to people as if he were having the most wonderful time in the world. He was not having the most wonderful time in the world. It was terribly difficult, terribly hard work, and constantly haunted by the fear that one of those braces would snap or the person on his arm would trip, and he would be exposed to the public.
I want to extend to the people of the state of New York.
The illusion of mobility allowed Roosevelt to avoid awkward questions about his health. But it was his progressive message that carried him into the New York governorship in 1928, and then, 4 years later, into a race for the presidency of the United States. In the fall of 1932, the Roosevelt Special traveled across the Plains states into the West. Few realized that every appearance was a carefully choreographed illusion.
He gave speeches at little towns, and at every town he had to put on his braces, and to do that you have to take off your pants, put on the braces, put his pants back on, stand him up, and he'd, leaning on the door, he'd step out on the platform and speak to the crowd.
The podium had to be bolted to the floor because the entire time he was speaking, he was really holding himself up with one arm. Sometimes he would gesture with the other one, but then he'd go back and grab the podium.
And there are pictures of him entering the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, going the length of a room crowded with people. And they go slowly so that Roosevelt can chat with the people along the way, and so that James can say hello. And James said he would grasp, FDR would grasp his son's arm so fiercely that James would want to call out in pain. But FDR told James, we're enjoying this. And, let everyone see that we're happy.
People must have been sort of willing to be deceived to some extent. And it is a deception, but without it, we wouldn't have had Franklin Roosevelt. And we need him.
It seems amazing today, but the public was never told that the president was paralyzed. Indeed, the press became willing partners in the subterfuge. They could see him in the White House being lifted into his wheelchair, saw the occasional pained expression as he tried to walk. But in the 12 years he served as president, they never wrote about or filmed his discomfort. Of the 35,000 still pictures in the Roosevelt Presidential Library, only 2 show him in a wheelchair, both taken by a cousin he trusted and not published in his lifetime. Clues to his disability can be found here at his home in New York. As a child, Franklin watched an ant burn to death in an accident involving an oil lamp. Now he installed a hand pulley elevator at Hyde Park, a way of escaping the second floor in the event of a fire. He carried that fear with him into the presidency.
He was terrified at the idea that in the White House he might be in his bedroom alone and there would be a fire and he couldn't get out. And even though everyone told him he'd hardly ever be alone, he never wanted his bedroom door locked. And he used to practice this incredible thing where he would drop from his bed onto the floor and then practice crawling to the door in case he had to get out in the case of a fire.
It was a problem going to the bathroom. Because what do? Get out of the chair, into the wheelchair, and so forth. Quite often in the Oval Office, FDR's valet brought him a bottle. Now, you don't live with this kind of making do in the way that other people are not faced with, without being totally aware of your infirmity.
The intense security surrounding the president eased his burden and meant that even at the end of his life, the vast majority of Americans still didn't know he was paralyzed.
Once he became president, he had the Secret Service. And if you're going to use a wheelchair, there's nothing better than having the Secret Service going ahead and smoothing everything out. Once at the funeral of Speaker of the House Bankhead down in Alabama, Secret Service raised the level of the street that the church was on so that Roosevelt could drive up in his limo and get out on a level and, with his toddle walk, enter the church.
For a time, the illusion of mobility matched the level of genuine progressive reform. FDR further expanded his control over the political agenda with sweeping gains in the 1934 midterm election. The Democrats emerged with a record 69 seats in the Senate. The Republicans in the House dropped to just 103 seats, the smallest percentage in their history. But to ensure continued cooperation from the Congress, Roosevelt traveled to Atlanta, Georgia in 1935 to preserve his support among Southern Democrats. It was a presidential charm offensive that would carry a heavy price. Often during his presidency, FDR would retreat to Warm Springs, Georgia, deep in the heart of the old Confederacy. This was a region that fiercely protected its way of life, and that included segregation. For a Northern aristocrat like Roosevelt, it was a time to forge a link with a core constituency within his own Democratic Party.
His long years in Warm Springs gave Southern congressmen who controlled many of the key chairmanships in both houses of Congress a feeling that Roosevelt was at least an adopted Southerner, and this was somebody that they could trust, and he knew how to sweet-talk them.
An unspoken condition of that cooperation was that Roosevelt would not challenge the South on the issue of race.
His demeanor is the demeanor of a man who's particularly comfortable with the culture of Jim Crow in the South and the racial civilization of the South, the racial inequality of the South.
Many around the president, including his wife Eleanor, felt the Southern system of segregation was morally indefensible. Yet FDR knew that attacking the underpinnings of Southern society would bring his domestic